So it's once again my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag presentation on Utah measuring water use here in Utah, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm Bob Kiter. I've got the privilege of serving as director of the Wallace Stegner Center. And let me again welcome not only the folks here in the moot court room at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, but also those a couple hundred by our count joining us online today. Let me begin, as we always do, with our acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between the tribes, states, and the federal government. And we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Before getting into today's events, let me just mention that today's lecture is the third in a four-part series addressing Utah water law as basically a lead-in to the Stegner Center's 28th annual symposium, which is on the future of the Great Salt Lake. We previously had a primer on Utah water law, the basics of it, by attorney Emily Lewis. We also heard about the Colorado River, whether we're in crisis or opportunity options by Amy Haas. And today we'll get into measuring Utah water use, which is sort of foundational to the application of our water law. And 2 weeks from today, on March 2nd, Yvette Converse, who's currently Chief of Science and Resources at Grand Teton National Park for the Park Service, but previously, until very recently, the field supervisor for ecological services, field house with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in Salt Lake City. She will address the question of considering wildlife in water management. I should note that these presentations are available on the College of Law's YouTube channel on the College of Law website. And again, I alluded to this, but on March 16th and 17th, the Stegner Center will present our 28th annual symposium on the future of the Great Salt Lake. Registration is open and required for the symposium. And that information is available on the Stegner Center website. Some upcoming, additional upcoming events for the Stegner Center. On March 27th, Natalie Koch, who's an author and professor of geography at Syracuse University, has a new book out entitled Arid Empires, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia. Fascinating study on the, if you will, similarities between the arid regions of North America, in particular Arizona, and the Middle East, in particular Saudi Arabia, and how each overlaps to some degree in how they approach water consumption and use issues. On Thursday, April 6th, we'll have with us Andrew Guilford, professor of history and environmental studies at Fort Lewis College, who also has a new book out on Bears Ears National Monument, and he will be speaking on Bears Ears Landscape of Refuge and Resistance. And then on April 13th, Ann Palmer, who previously was affiliated with the University of Utah and initiated the Osher program here at the university and is currently on overseeing a fellowship program at Stanford University, has collected letters from Wallace Stegner, and she will address the topic of corresponding with the young Wallace Stegner. With that, let me introduce our speaker today, Rick Maloy, who is the Water Conservation Manager at the Central Utah Water Conservancy District, who works with state and local water agencies to develop water conservation strategies and to drive real change in this area. Rick spent 16 years working in the field of water distribution and conservation. He's the current president of the Utah Water Conservation Forum. He served 10 years in the Utah National Guard. He holds a bachelor's from the University of Utah and a master's from Utah State University. And we're very pleased to have Rick with us. I should note two things. One, this series of 4 lectures on Utah water law is hosted and sponsored jointly by the Stegner Center and the Audubon Society. And we appreciate their support in this initiative. And then secondly, as I think Rick will illuminate for us, there's news today of some legislation that addresses this question of water conservation and measurement pending in the Utah legislature. With that, please join me in welcoming Rick Maloy. All you.
Thank you. Am I okay if I'm down here in the front? Okay, perfect. I'm really excited to be here. It's been a bit of a wild ride today. I spend a lot of my time talking about water conservation, water supply planning, the current situation with our current water supplies. And I was asked to speak about water conservation in particular to this morning to the turf industry. And so I spent an hour this morning in front of about 400 people, all in the turf industry, talking about the needs for change. I don't know if I've ever felt this way, but I think I feel more comfortable in front of a crowd of lawyers. So I'm excited to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. A little bit more background. I work for Central Utah Water Conservancy District. We're the largest wholesale water provider in the state of Utah. We manage a vast amount of infrastructure. We're also the primary diverter of Utah's portion of the Colorado River. That is critically important to our water supplies, and many people are unaware, but it sounds like you had a great presentation from Amy a couple weeks ago. But we deliver that water all the way up into Salt Lake and Utah counties, and it's critical and has been critical to the progress that we've seen along the Wasatch Front in particular. This is just a little map of our service area. We cover a lot of area, a lot of watersheds, manage a lot of reservoirs and infrastructure, and deliver a lot of water, and that's critical for us. So why, how, and why do we measure water? And that's what I want to focus on today. Why is it important? How do we do it? A lot of this may seem straightforward, but it gets very complex, and I hope that I can open the curtains a little bit, and you can peek in and we can have a discussion on it. One of the reasons that it's critically important that we measure our water is for water supply planning. This is a graph from the Division of Water Resources from one of their latest reports, and it's maybe a bit misleading in some regards, but it really looks at if we don't change our consumption, if we continue on the trajectory of use that we have been in the past, we'll run out of water at some future point. Now, this is looking at the state as a whole. There are going to be winners and losers within the state. There are cities, municipalities, locations that have more water. There are areas that have less water and will run out sooner. But if we look at it as a whole, it paints a really important picture that says, hey, we can't continue. And it's important that we measure and understand trends of water so that we can plan for the future. I'll also highlight on the right, there's some variability within our water supply. And that comes from things like conversion from agriculture to municipal and industrial use. Again, this is just looking at municipal water supplies. And also a downward trend. And that's because of climate change or climate variability. As we warm and our shoulder seasons in particular get warmer, we end up needing more water for irrigation, whether that's for your lawns or agriculture, whatever it is, that we will need more water to maintain and sustain those outdoor vegetation. Why else do we measure water? Well, we need to know where we've been. We need to know where we want to go. We want to look at goals and set objectives. How do we get there? If we go back to this slide, there's two bottom lines. There's the baseline, that's where we're hoping to be. And then there's the RCG, which stands for Regional Conservation Goals. And that's what this is right here. So if we meet these goals, then that says, hey, we've got enough water, hopefully, that we can extend out 50, 60 years without too many issues. So these regional goals they're an important part. We've got to measure so we know where we are, where we're going to go. Each one of these numbers here is measured in gallons per capita per day. And that's really what I want to focus on. So try and remember this picture. You see values from 2015, that's kind of the baseline, anywhere from 300 to 400 to 200. They're kind of all over the place. If we look at a statewide number, it's somewhere mid 200s. Now that probably sounds bad, and that's because there's a lot of information out there that says, hey, Utah is the worst. I don't know how many of you have seen some of these reports that say we use more water than anywhere else, and we misuse our water, or there's something wrong with how Utah is using their water supply. Now, I can tell you that there's a lot of room for opportunity. This is not in any way to dismiss our use and misuse of water. We know we can do better, and we are going to do better. And I'm encouraged by the trends that are happening. But I think it's important to know, what we're up against, what the media is talking about in terms of our water use. What are other people talking about in terms of Utah's water use? You can see here, there's a graph here on the right that says, we've got, Washington County uses 306 gallons per person per day. Compared to Las Vegas that uses 115. A news article that says, we're some of the worst in the state. Well, we had seen a lot of this information, and we wanted to know, how do we really measure Utah against some of these other areas? How do we measure one, like Washington County, one city, St. George, maybe against Las Vegas? What does that look like? Is it really reflective of what you see in this picture? And so Central Utah Water, in conjunction with the Division Water Resources and some other partners, commissioned a study. This study is what this presentation is based around, and it looks at that comparison of municipal and industrial water use across the West and how we compare. And how is water measured? Let's answer the question, is Utah really that wasteful? So to look at this, first we needed to understand what is gallons per capita per day. We know it's an important tool and valuable for tracking water use. We know it's important for setting goals. We know it's important for water supply planning. It seems like a very simple concept. You've got your annual water volume, some amount, and you're going to divide that by a population, which is another amount, and divide that by 365. And that presents you with a number. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and that's what we found. We already had a pretty good indication of some of these issues and scenarios, but we really wanted to do a deep dive. The first thing that we found is that to really understand gallons per person per day, or GPCD, we need to really understand the calculations. What goes into it? We knew that there was some variability. People are calculating things a little bit differently. What type of water use is it? What type of, is it industrial? Is it commercial? Is there some agriculture mixed into your municipal use? What does your population look like? When are you calculating? What volume of water is being reported? There are different stages where we report different sections of water. Losses, water loss. There are parts of this country that still have water mains that were built 100 years ago. There are cities within this country that have 50% water loss within their communities, meaning they deliver 100 million gallons a day and 50 million gallons just goes right into the ground. That happens. Here in the state of Utah, we're somewhere between 2 and 20% of the municipal water that we deliver is water loss, leaks, unaccounted for water, unbilled water. And that's important to note. That's not always measured. So is it included in some of this information? Return flows to the system. How does that play or impact? Are we reusing our water? How many times do we count the same drop of water? And then once we had kind of understood that there's a lot of variability within how water is calculated, then we need to know, can we compare? Are comparisons valuable? We are already being compared, so do we need to change what our information is so that we can be compared? Do we have a really good understanding of how somebody else is calculating their water so that we can formulate an apples-to-apples comparison? We want to do that. That's what we set out to do as part of this report. We really wanted to understand what is our water and can we compare it? And if we can, let's put that comparison out there. Let's show others what that comparison is. But each water system, like I said, calculates a little bit differently. And it took us a while to realize that there are so many different variables within that calculation that we need to narrow it down. The other thing I'll mention is when a municipality, let's say Tucson, publishes their gallons per capita per day, they do that not with an intent to be compared to somebody else. They do it for their own use. So they're saying, I want to compare from where I am today to where I was 5 years ago, and so we can continue to see what trends are happening. They never intended for it to be used other places. So most places don't say what and how they calculate it. They just say, hey, we're at 97 gallons per person per day. Great, that's great. You were at 112, now you're at 97, you've made progress. That's good. The other problem that we found is that there's not a national or industry standard. Whether it's the American Water Works Association or the Alliance for Water Efficiency, there's no standard. So everybody can calculate it a little bit differently, and we'll go into what these variabilities are. So let's look at how Utah calculates their water. So first we look at the types of users within our system. So we look at just municipal and industrial, which includes the estimation of non-potable water. So our secondary systems, or the water that we use in some parts of the state for outdoor irrigation for residential landscapes. We also look at the report level. So I mentioned this idea of volumetric measurement. So how and where do we measure water is important. And I'll get into a little bit more of that later, but you think about all the ways in which we measure water. Is it a meter at your house? Is it the level or the elevation of your reservoir? Is it flow meters in your rivers and streams? There's a lot of different measurement points within the water supply. So Utah reports it at the water use level, meaning where it comes into your house, where that meter is out in your front yard. That also means that it doesn't include non-revenue water. That water loss that I talked about. If that water loss occurs outside of your home, it's not being accounted for, or it needs to be estimated and included into that calculation. Indirect water use. We don't include treated wastewater that's returned to the system. A good example of this is up around in Heber Valley. They use some water, comes out of Jordanelle, it feeds their water supply. Anything that's used indoors then goes through a wastewater treatment plant and goes back into Deer Creek Reservoir, and then it flows down the Provo River to supply people in Utah County. So we treat that water at the treatment plant there in Orem. Some Orem residents use it, and then it goes back into Utah Lake. And out of Utah Lake, it might go to the Great Salt Lake. It might go to agriculture around the lake. Might go to secondary systems in Riverton and irrigate lawn in Riverton. Okay, so that's not being calculated. So we might calculate that same drop of water several times and account for it that way. We also don't include direct reuse. So there's not a ton of direct reuse, but it's something that we're talking about, something that could be included in the future. So if we look at it another way in graphical form, on the one side we have our potable water supply. So our drinking water comes out of the treatment plant and it goes into your house or your business. And there's the other section that's non-revenue. Again, that's leaks, unaccounted for water, unbilled water. Okay, maybe that's your fire system. Okay, and they're flushing hydrants or putting out fires. Then within your indoor use, you have, again, potable. Some systems like Salt Lake City, they don't have two separate systems. So some of that potable water, that drinking water, is being used outdoor on your landscapes. But the indoor water use, all of that goes through your system and into a wastewater treatment plant, and then either is available for direct reuse or more commonly indirect reuse. And then we have non-potable water or secondary systems. And this is something that is, the term secondary water or secondary system is unique to Utah, but there are plenty of other places, even in the West, that use non-potable water for irrigation. Okay, so this isn't something, a lot of other organizations don't report it, they don't calculate it, but they use it. So it's something to be aware of. We calculate it. We take that water supply and either we measure it through meters. The state has provided a large amount of funding to improve metering, and so we now have regulation that says all secondary connections will be metered within the next decade. But currently, our water use is largely based on estimation. So we're saying, here's how much the total volume is that's being sent through a system, and we're doing some estimation on how much is being used at a consumer level. But that does mean we have been including leaks, non-revenue water, within that calculation. So let's continue to talk about why maybe Utah is a little bit unique. So we have a little bit of a different water supply than a lot of areas, even within the West. And that water supply is largely dependent upon snowpack. That's probably very familiar to you. We see it. We know how that works. We know that it melts and into our reservoirs, but it does outline also how we use and consume water. We don't use as much water in the winter. We don't use it for irrigation during those off seasons because we don't need it. Again, we have a secondary system that's reported. We also have a statewide database at a system level. So that's something that I have yet to find a state that has the same level of data that we have within our state. We are very robust. We calculate a lot of water, and the state compiles that water information and is able to utilize it and publish it for the public to use and evaluate. The Division of Water Resources has their own method for calculating gallons per person per day. But we still have a lot of variabilities within our state. We, as a state, as an entire state, often get compared to one water user. So I can't tell you how many times I've seen a number that says Utah uses 250 gallons per person per day compared to Las Vegas, who uses 115. Well, is that a valuable comparison? We look right here on this graph, and I just pulled a few data points, but we look at precipitation. Alta, 47 inches of measurable precipitation in a year, average. And, you know, we think of Provo, Salt Lake, 17, 15, down to St. George, 9, Wendover, 3.5 inches. So there's a huge variability within rainfall and precipitation within the state, which means that our irrigation is going to vary widely and our irrigation needs across the state. I don't think many people in Logan are irrigating their lawns the same way as they are in Washington County or St. George. And so I think that that's important. So when we pull all of those numbers together, it's not really a fair comparison because of Utah large and so many variables within the state. So what are some of our water use drivers? I talked a lot about outdoor irrigation. Why do I talk about it? Well, along the Wasatch Front, 55% of our municipal water that we deliver is outdoor residential. So think of all of your residential landscapes. But the climate and those landscapes, their need, the temperature, all of that is different across the state. Evapotranspiration, which is what the plant needs to stay healthy, what does that number look like? Is it different across the state? Of course. Population, is it based on census data? Are there seasonal trends? If you live in Virgin, Utah, I promise you, your seasonal trends are going to be very different than if you live in Cedar City or if you live in along the Wasatch Front. Salt Lake City, years ago, working with Salt Lake City Public Utilities, talking about the influx of people from 8 to 5 in Salt Lake City grows by nearly 40%. So their water use jumps and skyrockets because of all of those people coming in to work. Now, it probably is a little different today with remote work and the urban sprawl that we've seen, but still, it's something to take account. What does your population look like? Housing age. If we look at Sugar House and the age of those homes compared to, Vineyard out in Utah County, those homes are going to be very, very different. The efficiency within the devices within the homes is very different. And so the water use patterns are going to be very different across those areas. Land use, distribution. We look at the density. Now, I want you to remember that slide that I shared in the very beginning that showed trends for water use. One of the biggest benefits, and maybe this is not a benefit to everybody, but benefits in water supply planning is densification. Now, for better or for worse, it's something that's happening. It's a trend that's happening, and it's largely related to the cost of land and a lot of economic drivers. But that lot size is a huge key point in looking at water use. The larger the lots you have, the more water that's being used on those landscapes. So if we look at Washington County, where they have a 10,000 square foot average lot size, we can't compare that to the west side of Salt Lake, West Valley, West Jordan, that area. They've got an 18,000 square foot average lot size. So that's something to consider. So the data that we evaluated for the report, like I said, the Division of Water Resources has and Water Rights has a very robust data set. So we were able to look at that and evaluate how we calculate and all of the variabilities. So we used Utah's Open Water Data Portal from 2015 through 2020, which is built from the bottom up. You know, there's small systems that feed into public systems and county, basin, and state, so we're able to get all of that information. Fortunately, we have a lot of secondary water that's metered, and the state requires estimation for what's not metered, so we have pretty good data set there. And then we look at where is there any water use reported, you know, not currently, so that's it. We're able to account for some of these variabilities. So through that, we've put together a state number. So the state in 2019 had 223 gallons per person per day. Now I talked a little bit about how maybe this isn't valuable. And we debated on whether or not we want to include this information because there's some risk involved with publishing data. But I think it's important to see that we are, we have some consistency there, but we are on a downward trend. I don't have 2020 data finalized yet, but it's going to be even lower. And even beyond that, it's come down quite a bit. So we looked at what Utah does, and now we wanted to look outward. We wanted to look and see what are other people doing. Are there any other emerging methodologies? And what we found is three dominant methodologies for how gallons per person per day is calculated. So I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but if you think of a total demand, a water use number, the water use, that middle one is how Utah calculates this last number right here. And then there's a consumptive use, and we'll get into that. So how does different methodologies change per capita use? I think that historically we don't think that we measure water differently. We don't think we measure population differently. We just assume that we're kind of all coming to the same conclusion. We looked at a set of data and we said, yep, that's the way I'm going to do it. I'm certain that everybody else does it that same way. So methodology number one, the total water delivered or total demand. This means that everything that enters into a system, okay, all of that water loss, all of the estimated water use, whether it's metered or unmetered, everything that goes into a system is being calculated and then divided by the population. So this is how the California Water Board requests their information. It's probably the most useful from a wholesale water supply standpoint. When Central Utah Water delivers water to Jordan Valley or to Orem City or any of these utilities, we want to know how much total water is being sent. That's important to us. We want to know how much water loss is happening and occurring within these systems. That's important for our water supply planning. But this is one methodology that's out there. The other methodology, and we've talked about this already a little bit, is the water that's used. Again, this is how Utah measures its per capita use. So we're looking at all of the water that goes through your meters, all the water that's used for your outdoor irrigation, and dividing that by the population. If it's estimated, then we're subtracting water loss out of that. And this, again, this is the method that we use here. The third dominant methodology for calculating water use is consumptive use. And this is how Las Vegas or Southern Nevada calculates their water. So they're looking at everything that goes through their meter, and then they're subtracting out any return flows. So Southern Nevada is a little bit different in some ways, but similar in others. So the water that they use indoors for their homes, their restaurants, the casinos, whatever, everything that goes down a drain then goes through their wastewater treatment plant and goes back to Lake Mead. So it's almost like a closed loop for indoor water. So they're pulling it out of Lake Mead and putting it right back. Well, their per capita numbers subtract out everything that's going back because they put it back to where it came from. So by saying that they use 115 gallons per day, can that be compared to 250 when we're looking at two different data sets? Now, this is important because we have a lot of beneficial uses downstream. What about the Great Salt Lake? Is that a good use of our discharge water to put back? Should we be saying that that's returned to the system? Can we use it again? We can't use it again. It's a little bit different. Okay, we can't pull that water back out and continue to use it. But is it a beneficial use? Of course. So we looked at that and we wanted to dive deeper. We knew that Southern Nevada and we knew that California, Met, and other organizations calculated a little bit differently. And we wanted to look at a similar data set, similar lot sizes, things like that. So we narrowed it down from statewide and we looked at Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District. We looked at their data set. And this is, if you're not familiar with their service area, but it's West Valley, West Jordan, South Jordan, Riverton, Harriman, kind of the west side of Salt Lake. And we used their data also because they have very little secondary water use that's unmetered. So we had a higher data reliability. And we were able to pull data from 2015 all the way through 2021, and it paints a little bit better of a picture. A couple things that I'll mention before I change slides here is that the population number is also a very interesting metric. Normally we think about it as just whatever your population is, but I can tell you that we talked with utilities who, before the census had came out, were using 8-year or 9-year-old census data for their population. So are we using census data? Are we using data that has been given to us from like current projections or current meter counts or utility counts? What does that look like? And so even within the population number, there can be a lot of variabilities. But thankfully, Jordan Valley measured their population in the same way that Southern Nevada did. The one thing I'll also mention is Southern Nevada, they don't account for any tourism within their population. So their number is strictly based on their residential population. And they have millions of visitors that come in every year that consume water. So there are some variabilities, but trying to account for that is difficult, and hopefully we'll get better and be able to continue our research with this. So what does it look like when we take Jordan Valley's numbers and we apply the different methodologies? Well, you can see in 2021, if we look at total demand, that's 191 gallons per person per day. If we look at it from a water use, the way that the Division of Water Resources measures, we are at 175 gallons per person per day. Well, if we look at consumptive use, the way that Southern Nevada measures, we're at 131 gallons per person per day. Now, this is, when we first pulled this data together, it was pretty surprising to note when we're looking at Southern Nevada and they've got 115 gallons per person per day, we're not that far off. You know, does that mean that we don't need to conserve? Of course not. Does that mean that there's not room for progress? No. We're going to get there. We're going to get lower. Why? Because we have to. It's important. But we looked at this, and we looked at some other data sets too, and they follow similar trends. Okay, so how we calculate and the methodology that we use is important. It's important for public perception. I mentioned that Central Utah Water is the primary diverter of Colorado River water. Well, we're right now in the midst of negotiations and really this tug of war for the limited amount of water that's left on the river. Now, opinions aside for how that water should be used, it's still important for the Wasatch Front. It's important for growth and economic stability. And when we get compared to Southern Nevada and say, hey, they're doing great, maybe you guys don't need your water because you're so terrible, it helps to be looking at the same data set. And what I want to really focus on is that the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's good opportunities to compare our water use. Really, it's within our own structures. We know we need to be better, so if we put out one number, we know that we need to drive that number down. We know we need opportunities for conservation and better management and use of our water, whether it's eliminating water loss and leaks within our systems, reducing outdoor irrigation. All of that plays a key part, but that's valuable to us and whatever number we use. If we use total demand, we want to see that number go down. But on a stage where we're constantly being compared to other users, it's dangerous, okay? And even ugly when you start to see that people are miscategorizing our use and saying, hey, you guys are horrible. What we need to say is we have room and we're going to continue to conserve and make progress, but be careful with how you calculate and what data you're collecting, because that can be damaging, especially if we lose a water supply because of it. So I don't have much more in the way of presentation, but I want to highlight a few more things. As Bob mentioned, there's current legislation. Senate Bill 119 talking about gallons per capita per day and how the state should report. Now, this is, it's very interesting. I don't know that I want to comment a whole lot about it, but I'm happy to discuss it. But one of the things that's interesting is now that we're on more of a national stage for water use, what it's trying to do, now whether it does a good job of it or not, maybe I'll let you be the judge of that. It's trying to get us to be consistent with other utilities, other areas. So it's looking at more of, let's focus on that consumptive use number so that if comparisons happen, they get compared to a little bit more fairly. Now, there's other components of that legislation that probably need some work, and we probably need to continue to evolve as a state and as regions and as water suppliers in how we report information and the transparency for which we calculate. Now, that's not to say that we weren't transparent before, but I can tell you that as we went out in the West and we tried to work with utilities, we found a lot of apprehension, and probably for good reason. They probably didn't want us to take their numbers and run it through this and show different numbers. We don't want to publish different numbers, but we want to understand. We want to understand, how do they calculate it? What goes into that? Are things left out? Are you looking at the whole picture? Why? So we can compare, so we know where we are at. The other thing is we've got to work on developing industry standards. So does this legislation help the state of Utah develop a standard? Sure. Does it help promote standards for other utilities? I don't know. I hope that then there becomes a pathway forward for everybody to start looking at the same methodology and the same data sets. And then, of course, we've got to coordinate with other Colorado River Basin states. It's critical that we work with them. I recently had a discussion with somebody from Wyoming, and they had published a per capita number, this city within Wyoming, and published a number that just looked at residential use. And that number was something like 60 gallons per person per day. Now, that could be very valuable for them. But if we don't coordinate and communicate and say, yeah, that works for you, keep that number, but what is it when you look at it this way? If we can coordinate and say, oh, yep, that looks good. That's the same way that we calculate. Now we can start to work together and we can say, yep, our landscapes look similar. Our water use trends are similar. We're seeing things go down. Here's what's worked here. Here's what can work for you. And we can start to collaborate. And that's really important. That's something that we've been doing with Southern Nevada. I'm sure many of you have seen our efforts with turf removal. That's something that they've been doing there to drive their water use down. The legislature just approved $10 million in additional funding for those types of programs. It's important. It's important that we work together because we can take what we've learned and we can start to implement it. And I think with that, I think I'll leave some time for questions. I hope there's plenty of questions. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. Happy to discuss further and happy to connect. But with that, what questions do we have?
Rick, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. I just want to make sure I'm coming through with the mic. We can take questions through the Slido app. I think we'll put that up on the screen. I've got a few already, more popping up to throw your way. And let me go ahead and just get started. A question asked about comparing water measurement with overall state use, and in particular, where does Washington County fall, and then and why? And then the question goes on to ask what infrastructure is being developed at a state level to implement stricter water use measurement and conservation laws.
Great question. So we did look at Washington County as part of this data set. It didn't make it into the report for a few reasons. One is the data reliability we didn't feel like we were there yet. But I will say it was high. It's not anything like what I showed in that first slide. It wasn't that high. But I will say that it follows similar trends depending on how you calculate. So it's similar in nature. There's a lot of room for conservation within that community, but it's not as high as you would think. So, and then the other part of that question is the state doing more? Yes. I talked a little bit about secondary meters. We are very pro measurement within the state, and the state has allocated millions and millions of dollars for improving measurement and data reliability.
That feeds into the next question. Is it common for states to measure non-revenue water, and would measuring non-revenue water aid in our Utah's conservation efforts?
That's a good question. So it's not common for states to measure non-revenue water, with the exception of California. And again, that's the California's water board. It's not something that the municipalities within California measure. I will say that Central Utah Water and other districts measure that way, but we rarely use per capita numbers as a metric. So when we look at how we deliver water, we are looking at what is the amount of water loss that's occurring within the municipalities or within the systems that we deliver. But that number doesn't really relate to per person usage in the same way that other things might. And so it's valuable to us, but I don't know that it makes sense to necessarily look at it on a per capita use. That would be saying, okay, if let's say a utility has 20% water loss, if we divide that 20% by the population, is that even a number that's helpful? It is, but it's not really in guiding the conversation. But good question.
And this goes to ag use, agricultural use. Is there a consistent standard of measurement for agricultural use? Given the high value placed on conservation among irrigation districts, the question goes on, it seems to be a good idea to have data and analysis on this point.
I won't get too far into it, otherwise we could spend a lot of time on this topic, but the answer is we have a long way to making sure that we have the same data sets for agriculture. So that's not to say that it's not measured, but it's not always consistently measured. There's a lot of different ways in which agriculture use is measured, whether it's on farm, is it through irrigation companies, and that's not to say that they're not measuring, but there's still room for improvement and ways that we can be better about the water that we measure within our agriculture communities.
So that it varies by county or district to some degree here?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. How does Utah's GPCD total demand compare with Arizona's or California's? They mentioned Tucson and Washington County also, so we're looking for a comparison.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. When we looked at California, they are often recognized as having some of the most aggressive policies, some of the most aggressive conservation measures. And when we broke it down by utility within the metropolitan water district of Southern California, for example, there were utilities that had per capita numbers in the high 300s. There were utilities that had per capita numbers in below 100. So it's really, really hard to just sit and show the variability. If you look at an aggregate, it leaves a lot of that information out. It's the same way with Utah. There are communities within Utah that have per capita numbers that are 700. There are communities that have per capita numbers that are 100. Why? All of the factors that I listed. I think of communities like Alpine in Utah County. Older community, there's a lot of new homes there too, but a very wealthy area, huge landscapes, and a very small population base. Now, is it fair to compare that community to Vineyard? Very new, very dense, lots of kids, so a very deep population. Their per capita numbers are very, very different. So when we looked at other states, we needed to get an image of that as well. And so we look at areas like Tucson, Santa Fe, and their per capita numbers might be 90, they might be 100, much lower than our communities here. But when we look at some of those areas, they might not account for outdoor irrigation use at all. They might have a secondary system that's not included in that information. So we evaluated some of that, but I will tell you, most of those communities were very resistant to me publishing their numbers. And so I couldn't include those yet, but we're hoping with collaboration, especially with negotiations on Colorado River, that we can start to work together to publish and standardize the information that goes out. It's a cautionary tale for me to say one number because there's so much that goes into it, and the variability is really dangerous because we don't know all of the things that go into it. But great question.
What agencies here in the state are held responsible to create a standardization of water use with the utility companies?
That's a great question. So we asked that, and I think the legislation kind of speaks for itself, that responsibility falls back to the Division of Water Resources, but ultimately it's something that the legislature says, hey, maybe this is the way that you should calculate that number. Now, for better or for worse, I think that it's important to note that whatever standard the state or the legislature comes up with doesn't prevent somebody from calculating it however they want to use within their system for their own tracking purposes. So we would encourage certainly utilities to continue to look at and evaluate water loss and non-revenue water as part of their information, whether it's included in a state number or not.
Conservation conversations often focus on indoor water use. Given the recovery rates of wastewater, aren't per capita outdoor rates more important? If so, what are the most effective measures to reduce outdoor water use?
That's a great question. Yes, I'll repeat it. So when we look at what is the most important for conservation, is it a lot of focus is put on indoor, and but certainly Utah's a little bit different. So I think I mentioned before, Utah, along the Wasatch Front, 55% of our municipal water that we deliver is used on outdoor residential irrigation. So that's where we focus a lot of energy on. Does that mean we should forget about the other things? No, but I can also tell you that our indoor water use is reused to a very high degree. We're probably 90+% of our indoor water use. If it goes down a drain, it's going to be put back into the system in one way or the other. So outdoor irrigation and landscaping is our focus. Now, of that 55% that's residential, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. We target that. A lot of people wonder why. They think, well, what about the parks or the church or the school or whatever? That institutional outdoor water use is probably 3 to 5% of our use. Very, very minimal. Within the reason we target residential, we did water checks with Utah State University, and we evaluated tens of thousands of water checks, data points throughout Salt Lake County and Utah County, and found that the average homeowner was irrigating 60 inches of water on their turf compared to what the plant need, which is 30 inches. So most people were over irrigating by nearly double. So that is one way that we can reduce our water use. The other is just reduction of turf. Turf is the when crop in Utah, and it doesn't feed anybody. So we look at that. That's not to say that we're anti-turf. I had to talk about that today when I talked with the Turf Association. But we're certainly looking at, there are areas of our landscapes that we can remove sections of turf that are not functional. The governor has been talking about this a lot. If the only time you walk on it to mow it, or the only time you walk on it is to mow it, get rid of it. And so we have incentives, and that's what the state provided, that $10 million, which really ends up being $20 million because that's only partial funding, or 20 million potential dollars that could go in the state for turf removal. So we're trying to do everything we can. But glad that question came up.
This ties back into the Colorado River and negotiations that are going on there. And as according to the question, reclamation data concerning water use from the Colorado River are published for each state and become the basis for the negotiations. Are those data consistent? Are they believable? Are they the correct data to be using for these negotiations? Does the state sign on board with that data or not?
That's a great question. Talking about the Bureau of Reclamation, they publish information every year from each state. It's tough. It's really tough because we provide them with information and we make some assumptions that everybody else provides the same level of information with the same level of reliability and that nothing is left out. That's not the case. Not everybody reports water the same way, and not everybody is looking at water the same way. So we in Utah, despite what maybe others think, we really value water. Not only do we value the water, we value water data, which means for years we've been estimating secondary water. Well, there's a lot of secondary water out there that's being consumed that's not being accounted for the same way that we do. And so we often get a black eye because we are so, maybe the term is, in love with that data. And so for better or for worse, we have it. So now that we have it, it gets used. Other areas in the West don't have that same level of data, so it doesn't get used. So there is some variability with that. That's not to say that the Bureau of Reclamation is trying to mislead, but they don't have, if they don't have the information, they don't have it. So that's probably how I'll comment on that.
Maybe a short answer here is groundwater use incorporated in any of this data and measurement?
Yes, yes. So all of the information that we provided included both surface water and groundwater use, and yeah.
Would most agricultural use be secondary water? So in terms of measurement and factored into the measurement system that you're explaining?
Yes, so secondary water use, if it's in a, we did a really good job with this data set to exclude secondary water use for agriculture. So that is not included. There may be some small like hobby farms within a municipality that aren't classified as agriculture, so that data wasn't pulled out. The reason we have secondary systems is because of agriculture. So agriculture existed here before we came, or at least in most of the urban or suburban areas, there was agriculture there. And as agriculture converted to homes and a municipal system, that same irrigation structure and those rights for especially water like out of Utah Lake that can't be used for drinking water systems was then repurposed into secondary irrigation systems.
Let's see.
I think I saw a question here in the audience. Did somebody have a hand up? Okay.
I incorporated it.
Oh, okay, never mind.
Let's see. We'll wrap up in just a minute or two. One question is, what are some of the GPCD numbers for California utilities that use the total water demand method?
Yeah, so when they use the total water demand method, they are, and I apologize, I'm going to say a number here, but it's going to be a generalization. So it's low 100s is what we see. So without having the data set in front of me, I don't want to say one specific number, but they are doing very well. But that's not to say that there's also not a huge room for improvement. One of the things that California also looks at is an indoor only metric. So they do have a separate classification for indoor water use only. And so that when they look at water, they do also have other methodologies that they use. But the state board looks at one number, and it's pretty good.
Well, with that, let me thank Rick for taking the time to enlighten us on water measurement here in Utah today. Let me thank all of you, both here present in the moot court room at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and those of you who joined us virtually. for being with us today. Let me remind folks that on March 2nd, we will address considering wildlife in water management, the fourth in our four-part series on Utah water law and policy. And also remind again that the Stegner Center's annual symposium is scheduled in mid-March on the future of the Great Salt Lake. With that, please join me in thanking Rick Maloy for his presentation today.